I thought maybe I'd just answer a quick question I got on Twitter. But yeah, so I keep thinking about making another top 5 video, but at the running back position, and I'm digging into the running back profiles pretty heavily right now, and I'm nearly ready. But at the same time, I'm filling out my wide receiver ranks. Way too deep, but I do like to have a good sense of who's deeper down in the class that might just be getting underlooked or underrated. Dropped a quick video not so long ago, but some of the names were standing out recently, and I thought about doing that again. But honestly, while I'm trying to make it here on YouTube, I'll be honest, I am. But I just can't. Here's your next big sleeper thing isn't my lane. I'm more about understanding what players did compared to players in the past to give us a good level of expectation for what they could do at the NFL in the right situation, on the right landing spot, or if their numbers are telling us good things instead of just being random numbers. A question I got on Twitter recently was, why Ronnie Bell? Why do I have Ronnie Bell circled in one of my images that I post to Twitter constantly at 3 a.m. while I'm grinding statistics? And I thought an easy answer, or an answer for that would actually get us a video this week to tell you a little bit more about how I process or get a good understanding of what wide receivers did in college, would be to answer that question. Why do I have Ronnie Bell circled in one of the images I have on Twitter? So let me show you something about the process that happens after I run the model, I create a model, and then run the model on this year's rookie class. I'm living in my spreadsheet. I know, I'm as excited as I've ever been as a little boy. So the first thing to know is this is a tab I make for myself using the database, which you all have, because I like to import certain things, just take a look at it and then compare it to other things, rather than filter through the whole database constantly. I try and create a secondary tab, one, and then not interfering with the main one, and two, I can just mix and match and cut and paste and see what's working for me, what's giving me a good idea what's going on. So the first thing you should really know is right here, this column right here called production score. I recently added my pre-draft model back into the database because I've been working on it with some of the new PFF data. I still think we can do better, but I don't try to solve a rookie class with a model so much as get a good understanding of how they compare in the best model an idiot like me can create, and then go looking for common red flags or commonalities that it might be missing, or that I might not be good enough to model into an actual statistical model, but are worth noting, right? So the production score is literally the model that I run minus the drafted rate, because part of my models consistently over the last few years taken into account how often wide receivers are drafted in the first 3 rounds from that particular team. Now inside that number is a lot of different things. One, there's competition level supposedly, and two, there's likely expectation of draft capital, so there's a lot going into that before we get the draft, and that's kind of where I borrow draft signal before we get there. Some people use the combine. I hate the combine. I prefer to use drafted rate for that team, because NFL teams tend to be pretty much sticklers for where they take players from, especially in the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft. So it's not really a number I can parse out into what's competition and what's draft expectation, but I know those things are going into it. But if I remove that number, how much of their signal is coming from their raw numbers in my model, comparing them to past players that have gone on to do well in the NFL? So just a simple thing to note is that a few players are scoring almost nothing based on their actual production, but are getting boosted largely because of where they're playing. Now again, that's not necessarily nothing, because competition level is a thing, as is expectation of draft capital, and where you're playing says something about how high rated you were as a high school prospect, so there's a lot running into it. But a simple way that I try and get an understanding of the numbers I'm looking at is just looking at the over-unders of those types of minimums. So if we look at the history since 2016 of players that have scored less than equal 3 in my overall model for just using their production, and then go hunting out players who actually did pretty well in the NFL, and what we see is there's relatively few examples. Chase Claypool, Juwan Johnson apparently counts, because he's had at least one top 36 season. That's what I filtered this by. Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, and Hunter Renfrow. The first thing to note is I really didn't like Chase Claypool's profile, and history has borne that out to be true, because he never repeated his top 24 season, and he was largely a touchdown regression candidate, and that's where the story ends for fantasy. But it is worth noting that just because you don't get a great production score doesn't mean that you're not good or can't play at the NFL, but it does have a pretty strong correlation to who is more or less relevant for fantasy, right? And the other two names that jump off the page here are Terry McLaurin and DK Metcalf. So just because they score below a 3 in production score doesn't mean they're not great, but DK Metcalf and Terry McLaurin are both people who were watching the tape were telling me that wasn't true. DK Metcalf, Jake Anderson at NFL Draft Talker, or at least it used to be, was my co-host at the time, and we argued a lot about DK Metcalf versus AJ Brown. Turns out we're both right. Actually, he was arguing against N'Keal Harry, and he turned out to be right. So one of the many lessons, one of the many times I've learned that it's worth listening to other people that take on information in a different way. So it's really interesting to me that anyone that scores low in this model either ultimately didn't pan out significantly, legitimately had terrible stats. Like Hunter Renfrow legitimately did very, very little in college. Like he's averaging a 12% target share. Like you just can't bet on those players. The whole premise here is players that are productive in college go on to be productive in the NFL. While there are exceptions, it's not like we can just draft all the unproductive players. Like that's everyone. That's not the productive players. There's no way of filtering, and productive players hit more often than they don't. So you're going to get misses. But the key miss here is DK Metcalf, and he suffered a lot of injuries, only really played 1 year. His averages are going to look terrible. That doesn't move me on to best season, but it does let me know when someone like Jake is shouting at me, literally, this guy is better than that number says. It's one of the many lessons that have taught me to go dig into that profile a little more, maybe hedge towards your silly little model not predicting the future perfectly. And same with Terry McLaurin, there's a Ohio State problem in general, especially in that era. Wide receivers seem to be underused, specifically in that era, despite Michael Thomas and Terry McLaurin coming out back-to-back years and doing well. And Ohio State has produced a lot of good wide receivers since, but only those two players specifically have underrated numbers. Michael Thomas, you'll notice, doesn't filter into this list. He actually looks a lot better now. I've got slot rate data and ADOT data, but Terry McLaurin still makes the list for my overall production score. So it's worth noting, one, it's not perfect. Definitely look closer at players other people like. That's what I've learned. But in general, if you're not scoring well in the production score, it's a very, very small hit list. And there are a lot of players every year that are hitting below 3 in my production model. And my production model scales on points per game, by the way, so while it's not accurate, you don't actually expect them to get 3 points per game through the first 3 years. That's where the number comes from. This is you're struggling with what 16 means versus 10. It's trying to predict points per game through their first 3 years on average. That doesn't mean much to me. It's just trying to help explain what the scale is to this. Alright, so that's one of the first things I look at. And so someone like Julian Fleming and Jeremy Burton, and who else here? Jonathan Mingo, scoring pretty well, but most of it is coming from their drafted rate, how often players from that team are being drafted. So I largely ignore it unless someone like Jake, someone like Zach, someone like Addison Hayes from the DLF YouTube channel points them out to me that something might be going wrong with my model. I need to look closer, because there are a lot of players to work through and you have to start somewhere. And so I tend to trust the model outside of not a lot of their production being the reason for them scoring fairly highly. Quick note, through my top 5, I do have some changes to my ranks in the top 5 since that video. I've moved Keyshawn Butte down. Principally not because of his combine, but because of the combine. In other words, I don't care about his numbers, but they definitely didn't encourage warmth and good feeling from the NFL, is my best guess, and continue to further the questions that we have about his profile, about his on and off-field performance, and his concentration and stuff like that. I don't know the answers to those questions, but if the NFL has got more reasons to ask them, I become decreasingly less convinced he'll get good opportunity in the NFL, and so I moved him down to the bottom of that second tier. Just a quick note. What else can we see here? So the next stage is actually just to get, the first stage is to get an understanding of the numbers that I'm looking at. What does my production model do? What does it say? And where are the exceptions? Just so I have a good idea of what I'm actually looking at. Again, I found my most success trying to understand the limits of what numbers or different statistics or models are telling you, where the exceptions were, commonalities to those exceptions. So someone like Cedric Tillman, who's scoring like a 5.7 in production score, which is actually pretty decent. If you look below 5 or 5 and below, you actually have a few hits with top 24 seasons that were definitely good players and definitely are good players now. And that drafted rate was telling us more that their production was actually more valuable because of where they were playing. Again, there's a lot going into that drafted rate number. But Cedric Tillman ticks off several red flags for me, including the fact that he only played 1 year above my average thresholds of opportunities per game. He did it in his very last year at age 21. You have to be pretty impressive, or there has to be pretty decent context for me to consider that his production score is equal to someone like JSN's or Jackson Smith's Njigba, and with only 1 season, who was doing it at 19. And when you dig into his profile, he looks like a deep down the field, large A-dot guy. He's got a 16 A-dot and an 8% slot rate. He did it in his last season, so you've got that senior difference working towards him. Teams and coaches know they're going on to the NFL. It's not that I want to dismiss him, it's just that I don't think that 5.7 in production score, that 9.1 in my overall model, is true. He just triggers a lot of red flags, and he's probably just a senior breakout. More expectation of draft capital because of where he was playing, but ultimately not a player I want to rank anywhere near where the model score tells him. So that's the other thing I'm looking for, understanding what my statistics say, and then looking for very common red flags that have consistently proven to be true over time with the limitations in what I can model. Alright, now the thing I want to get to today is because I don't have conference adjustments in my model or anything else. I don't find, like, that's the problem with drafted rate. We don't know how much of it is competition, how much of it is opportunity of expectation, and how much of it is just reality is never going to conform to any particular model. But I do like to look at how well players compared to players that went on to do well at the NFL level from that conference, because conference is a pretty decent indicator of a common grouping. It's a good way of sampling, but there's just no adjustment I found that has been consistently good at adjusting production scores using it. But I do like to take a look at it, and so the other thing I look at is a percentage over or under in receiving yards per team pass attempt, age adjusted, and that they were based on players that went on to have at least one top 36 season. So it's not a particularly strong threshold, but somewhat fantasy relevant. And there are a lot of different examples of players that are relatively unproductive for fantasy that cross that threshold. Van Jefferson, pretty decent NFL player, has a top 36 season, so he filters into that list. So it's a fairly low expectation in terms of fantasy relevance, just saying. And that gives me some indication of if players were doing well based on other players from a similar grouping through time. And so you can see that JSN is like 62% above his conference average, and that conference is fairly well drafted into the NFL, like 6.7 drafted rate. So 6.7 of the players drafted in the first 3 rounds in the last few years have come from that conference, and JSN is demolishing it. Again, there are problems with JSN's number in that he's only got 1 year, but it wasn't 19. It doesn't look like a senior breakout. And based on where he was playing with an 88% slot rate and a 9 ADOT, his yards per route run were 4. Like, I kind of believe that 60% number. He was outperforming most players who have that role at that higher level or that level of competition. And so we run that process over everyone else that didn't score at least 3 in the model. Because I'm going to look at those players as someone like Zach points them out, or Addison or Ray GQ says this guy's better than his numbers say. Then I will look deeper into their profile, essentially using my by year tab, because it's another tab I create for myself, so I can dig through their individual seasons before going and looking at them even more in depth if it warrants it. But let's just filter them out for now for simplicity. So the next thing I'll do is go over their conference score. How well were they playing in my favorite stat for wide receivers relative to their conference rate. And so you see outside of the top 5, which stops around here, you'll see players like Quentin Johnson is 11%, Marvin Mims is 11% below the receiving yards per team pass attempt average, but Zach keeps mentioning him to me, and digging through his numbers, I find better context, especially the fact that his slot rate is 52% and his ADOT is 17, which is unusual. It's an unusually high average, and so I think more context is to that, but that's a player that only gets highlighted because of someone like Zach points them out. And players that stand out to me, like Ronnie Bell, that's where his name came up. His receiving yards per team pass attempt was 10% above his conference average. He was playing in the Big Ten. And there are 2 other players in here which I thought were interesting from the Big Ten, called Jaden Reed and Trey Palmer, both of who I mentioned in that video. I hadn't come across Ronnie Bell yet. They're slightly less above the Big Ten average of 7% and 1.6%, but at least highlights them as someone to look into further. Because you see the most, like C.J. Johnson or Xavier Hutchinson, who's also interesting, and Tone Green, most are going to score significantly below the conference average of hits, despite that being such a low threshold for fantasy relevance in the NFL. And so that's the next list of players I go hunting up. So Jaden Reed and Trey Palmer are both interesting, and that's why I had Ronnie Bell highlighted. Because his overall stats are decent, he's scoring a 6 in my model, at least 4 of that is coming from his production. He's coming from a lower drafted conference, lower drafted team, only 1.5% of picks have come from the Michigan team that he was playing on in college. And Jaden Reed has slightly lower expectations, with 0% for Jaden Reed coming from Michigan State, and only 0.7% of top 3-round picks coming from Trey Palmer's team, Nebraska. So that gives me some level of expectation and some understanding of where their overall production score is coming from. But because they were good relative to their conference in receiving yards per team pass attempt, I dig in a little further. I make some notes. I end up ranking them in my Patreon rank sheet, which you can see all my ranks on, which is why I don't just want to walk you through my top. I've got 17 wide receivers ranked at this point, and just reading them off to you in 2-minute profile seems superfluous. There are some other players, like if you look at A.T. Perry or Puka, and I'm still learning this, or Puka. Both of them were relatively good. They're scoring a 2.7 in Puka's case, receiving yards per team pass attempt, and 2.4. They're both playing in different conferences. The problem with Puka is that he's coming from the Independence Conference, and you'll notice he has no conference average because no player has recorded a top 36 season in this time frame from the Independence Conference, but I do happen to know they have elevated stats. So when I look across and I see that he's got like a 3.5 yards per route run, that looks great. I can understand why someone in my Discord wanted me to check him out, but I have relatively little history to compare that to. When you look at his overall team stats of 2.7 receiving yards per team pass attempt, that's decent for most conferences, but in the Independence Conference, I know they tend to be elevated, and so I'll go looking for other Independence Conference players to compare him to. For example, Antonio Golden Gandy is someone I got really interested in a few draft classes ago in 2020, but he was at like a 2.8 receiving yards per team pass attempt, and that's a high number. That's a relatively high number for the Independence Conference. Puka's number isn't nearly as positive, but again, are they playing slightly different roles? And so I'll go dig into the year tab and see if there's anything else. For example, Antonio Golden Gandy was running in the slot a lot less, at a similar ADOT, that means they're playing a slightly different role, but he also had a 30% target share, and some of these other numbers that describe how they were playing, like target share and yards per route run, and targets per route run, start to become interesting to try and understand how they compared. The next thing I'll look at is how well those players compare to hits. Now that's from all conferences because there are relatively few hits even using our minimal threshold. But this number right here is, again, just looking at the number that's the main feature of the model. Their ADOT and slot bucketed receiving yards per team pass attempt, average of those who've gone on to have at least one top 36 season, and how well their average compares to that average. So after I look through the actual model and understand what its limitations, understand their overall role on their team by looking through the year tab and understanding how they were making their numbers, and if there's more context to it, like an AJ Brown or a DK Metcalf playing abominably low numbers of games, but in that one season were particularly well, or someone like a Cedric Tillman just blowing up in their third year despite being available in the other years, and what the context is to their overall production. After doing that and looking at the conference level, I'll then go and look at them as a direct comparison to hits. And so, a few players that stand out there outside of our main group that everyone knows. Ronnie Bell turns up again. He's slightly above average for his ADOT and his slot bucket, 0.2 receiving yards per team pass attempt above the average of hits. Again, we know that number is slightly elevated because he's playing in the Big Ten, but his conference score is also pretty good, and so that just highlights Ronnie Bell again. Again, one of the reasons I had him highlighted. Now, someone like A.T. Perry or Xavier Hutchinson, someone that Zach has mentioned from his film watching, was worth a deeper look. But A.T. Perry stood out because while he's basically on the average of his conference receiving yards per team pass attempt, he was above average compared to hits, playing in the ACC. So I did dig into him a little further, made a few extra notes about what he did on a year-by-year basis, and went and looked at his role a little deeper. Tank or Nathaniel Dell, depending on which data you're looking at, he'll be listed as either. He's actually slightly more interesting. While there's a relatively low drafted rate from the American Conference, he was 13% above his conference average and relatively close to the hit average despite playing in the American Conference and being above average. That makes him more interesting than A.T. Perry and Hutchinson for me. But again, there's no way I can weight in. Zach mentioned him, and they're both playing in distinctly different roles, with Hutchinson playing like a below 10 ADOT and a 23% slot rate, whereas Tank Dell is playing with an above 12 ADOT and a 40% slot rate. But it does highlight them for me and help me rank them relative to my expectation for what they're going to do in the NFL. But yeah, those are some of the numbers I look at. Jaden Reed, another name I've mentioned, again, above average for his conference and relatively close to the average for hits, so he deserved closer looking at. Trey Palmer is someone that stood out to me before because he's above average in both, although not nearly as high above his conference average as someone like Nathaniel Dell, or Ronnie Bell for that matter, but he is above the average of hits despite only having a 2.0 or 2.03 receiving yards per team pass attempt. So it's just a way of finding players that might be more productive relative to their situation than the overall model is capable of looking at. So those are the two main filters I look at. And again, I do keep saying, and then I go looking further, and I do. But a lot of this is experience and just doing the same process, getting a good understanding of what's happened in the past, where the exceptions were, the limitations on my model, the limitations on receiving yards per team pass attempt, who did it miss, why might it have missed on them, and that gives me, I find, a good experience in how to look over an individual player's career to understand if the model is just underrating them, and if they get more draft capital, we should definitely be more interested than we are. So that's just a quick look at how I start looking at players more in depth. The model's going to give me an idea. I have an idea of the expectations that I can have of my model, and I'm going to go look at the players who are getting more from their production than their drafted rate, just to see if there's anyone that's underrating, and then I'll go look at their conference average, how they compare to the conference average, and then the average of overall hits, and then I'll go looking at anyone that someone else using a different process has highlighted that I missed, or those three filters didn't highlight in particular, just to get an understanding of what they did and whether I see any common red flags, or I'm used to seeing exceptions with that different context on a player's season, to get an idea of how to relate to that, or how to reject that, or how to argue against that, and that's the process. That's how I run through players that might be under or overrated relative to what they actually did in college, just by looking at how well they compare to players on different levels of expectation, using different contexts and different buckets, and not just using an overall model, because I don't think a model is ever going to solve it for us. Again, this isn't a perfect video, it doesn't give you a ABC, but I just wanted to run through some names that are standing out to me, and also give you an idea of what I mean when I say look closer. This is some of the next step of just getting an understanding of what they did relative to different contexts of where they were playing and when they were playing it and what role they were playing it in. Just because context is king, I guess. Let me know what you think. Please check out the data. I just added a whole bunch of new IDs, so new players from the 2021 class, in the free pin database, because the combine happened, and that always gives me access to more dates of birth and more IDs, so I can actually add their stats. That one is free. If you want to see my ranks, it's on Patreon. Costs you a whole $1, but you can see some of my misspelt notes if you're interested in them. Anyway, want to get back to it, want to start going into running back, so I just needed a way to wrap up some of the wide receiver stuff other than just literally reading through my ranks, which did not seem fun. But let me know what you think. Thanks very much, and I'll see you in the next video.